This is Cast the Past. This episode, A Winter's Ghost. This is a story of murder and body snatching. It is also a story of a haunting and a spectre who refuses to fade. These are real events that happened in 1902. Today, Northenden is a suburb of Manchester, England. Not so in 1902. Then it was a North Cheshire village, a rural backwater of charming cottages, grand houses, and leafy lanes. Although only 5 miles from industrial Manchester, its river, the Mersey, set a traditional boundary between the two. While in Northenden village life had hardly changed in 400 years, Manchester had seen nothing but change. It was a sprawling industrial city, one of the first in history. Manchester's wealth lay in the production of cotton goods for the world. The city was informally called Cottonopolis, and many made their fortunes there. However, Manchester's professional and commercial class did not want to live amongst the smoke and the squalor, and Northenden, with its natural charms and within commuting distance, was the perfect place to set up home. John Gibson Dyson, a 33-year-old Manchester solicitor, was one of the new wave of professionals to have moved to the village. He lived in a large property called Bradley Gate House on Lonley Lane. He was wealthy enough to keep a staff of servants, 2 gardeners, and a coach and horses. From the rear of his house stretched fields, farms, and a forge, with the parish church of St. Wilfrid's close enough to hear its peal of bells. It was an idyllic home. All was going well for John Dyson. His practice was thriving. In the village, he was well respected, and in June, he was to marry his sweetheart, Lucy. However, on Friday the 21st of February 1902, all this would dramatically change. An event nearly 2 years earlier would set in motion a grisly chapter in the village's history. In 1901, Dyson had dismissed his 78-year-old butler, Augustus Frederick Cotterill. The reason for his dismissal was known to all around the village. Cotterill was a bad-tempered, argumentative type who took offence easily with all who crossed his path, including the other servants in the Dyson household. Later, he would be described as having a vindictive nature. And if that were not bad enough, he was the only man in the area who had supported the Boers during their recent war with the British. On Mafeking Day, when the villagers celebrated British fortitude, Cotterill had taken an old black shawl and hoisted it from a window at Bradley Gate House. It was as though Cotterill deliberately sided with the enemy to cause maximum offence. His notorious stance earned him the name Kruger, after the famous Boer leader. Cotterill caused so much upset and bad feeling with the other servants that Dyson had no alternative but to dismiss him. After his dismissal, he lived a semi-vagrant life, regularly entering the workhouse at nearby Stockport. And during all this time, his resentment for his old master grew, until it turned to rage and an urge to take revenge. At Christmas, destitute and alone, Cottrell was seen trudging along the lane. He approached a young boy and asked him if he lived at Bradley-Gate House and whether Mr. Dyson was at home. Clearly, Cottrell was scheming some sort of vengeance. And so, on a cold winter's morning, on the 21st of February, at 20 minutes past 8, Dyson approached his master's home. He knew the front door would be unlocked and stole into the house. He also knew Dyson kept an array of firearms in his cabinet in the front room. Stealthily, silently, he armed himself with 2 pistols and placed 2 more in the deep pockets of his torn long coat. Now armed, Cottrell crept upstairs. For a moment, he waited outside the door to Dyson's bedchamber. He listened momentarily, then burst inside. Dyson was still in his bed. He had barely time to register what was happening before Cottrell fired 2 shots into him. Then Cottrell turned around and made his retreat. On the landing, he was confronted by the butler and the housekeeper, Mr. and Mrs. Coombs. Despite his shambolic appearance, they recognized him at once. He pointed the pistols at them. "Go back or I'll shoot you," he said. They didn't reply, but Cottrell noticed the wide-eyed terror on Mrs. Coombs' face. She was looking straight past him. He turned his head and followed her gaze. On the landing behind him stood her small son. "Let me have my little boy," she pleaded. "I won't hurt him if you both go down," he replied. Reluctantly, both parents retreated down the stairs, leaving their little boy stranded on the landing. Mr. Coombs, the boy's father, ran for help. He brought Thomas Hewitt, the gardener, back with him. Hewitt cautiously climbed the stairs. He found Cottrell still on the landing with the boy at his side. Mrs. Coombs joined him. "Stand back, or I'll shoot you," Cottrell said, and pointed his pistol first at the gardener and then the housekeeper. Then he turned his head once more and stared at the boy's face, now white with terror. Then Cottrell stood aside and let him pass. The boy fled into his mother's arms, and all 3 retreated down the stairs. But Cottrell was not finished. He returned to the bedchamber and, for good measure, fired 2 more shots. This time to Dyson's head, his brain seeping onto the pillow. With acrid gun smoke choking the air, Cottrell made his escape through the front door. Hewitt and Alfred Price, another gardener who had joined him, left the house through the back door and then through another gate. They hoped to see in which direction Cottrell was fleeing. Catching sight of the pair, Cottrell yelled, "Are you there again?" and shot at them twice. Fortunately, he missed. Cottrell then turned and walked towards the lane. A hue and cry went around the village. Sergeant Foster of the Cheshire Constabulary arrived on the scene. The village police station being no more than a short walk from the house, the gunshots had alerted him to the grave situation. He made his way to the front door of the house, only to be confronted by Cottrell not 6 yards away. Cottrell took a revolver from his pocket, calmly took aim and pulled the trigger twice. Mercifully, the weapon did not fire. Without hesitation, the murderer took another pistol from his pocket. Sergeant Foster backed away towards the gateway and out of the line of fire. British police officers generally do not carry firearms, and Sergeant Foster was unarmed. Taking shelter, Foster ordered the butler to fetch him any remaining guns that might be in the house. The butler brought him 2 hunting guns. Foster took one, and Police Constable Lawson, who had just arrived, took the second. Now, armed, they searched for Cottrell and saw him 30 yards down the lane, making in the direction of the railway station. They gave chase. Age might not be on Cottrell's side to make a quick escape, but he was armed and dangerous. As they approached, Cottrell turned and fired. The policemen threw themselves to the ground. Then, using the trees and hedges as shields, they returned fire while steadily moving along the lane in pursuit. Cottrell turned and, running backwards, unloaded both revolvers at the policemen. A gun battle ensued. Bullets whizzed across the lane, splintering gates, chipping masonry and shattering windows. Bystanders in the line of fire cowered on the ground or sheltered behind trees. Eventually, steadily, the police made progress until they were within yards of Cottrell, who was shielded behind a thick oak tree, with only part of his back visible.
"Hands up!"
Sergeant Foster yelled. Cottrell stepped from behind the tree, his back still turned, his body stooped. Then he raised his hands, a pistol in each. Now he turned and fixed his stare on the sergeant. Buckshot, fired from the constable's hunting gun, had torn a wide rent in Cottrell's coat, from which a dark mass slowly spread. A bullet had smashed a thigh and blood gushed down one leg. His face was blackened and singed and pocked with shot. Heat streamed from his head and wounds and into the frigid February air. But his stare remained fixed on the sergeant. Resigned to his fate, he sneered defiantly to the last. Before the policeman could move to arrest him, Cottrell placed the pistol he was holding in his left hand to his head, then fired. He slumped in a heap on the frozen ground and dead leaves. When the police searched him, they found stashed in his overcoat 68 rounds of ammunition and a spare revolver. Being a Friday, the police secured the murderer's body in a makeshift morgue. In the biting winter of 1902, the stables close to St. Wilfrid's Church provided perfect cold storage for a corpse. They would leave Cottrell's corpse there over weekend while they awaited instructions from the county coroner. If the events of the morning were not enough, a series of macabre events now followed. Over the weekend, in the village, emotions ran high until they erupted on the Monday. That evening, incensed and inebriated, some of the villagers decided to administer their own justice to Kruger. They gathered at the stables and broke open its lock. Once inside, they snatched Cotterell's corpse. Under the hiss of gaslight, they heaved it to the village green with the intention of kicking it down the lane and dumping it in the nearby River Mersey. However, before they took their chance, a rumour spread that the police had returned. The crowd fled, leaving the corpse sitting upright on the village green. The body snatchers were right. The police had returned. A tip-off had alerted them to the unrest. This time, there would be no more opportunities for the village vigilantes. The corpse was returned to the stables and a policeman stationed on sentry for the duration. The inquest was held 3 days later in a room at the Church Inn within the shadow of the church and the stable where Cotterell's body still lay. Presided by Mr. Newton, the Cheshire County coroner, the inquest was short, lasting but a day. The jury were taken to Bradleygate House to view the body of Mr. Dyson, and then taken to the stable to see Cotterell's corpse. After hearing eyewitness accounts, the jury exonerated the policeman of all blame in Cotterell's death. They found a verdict of willful murder against Cotterell for the death of Dyson. Regarding Cotterell's death, the jury found a verdict of justifiable homicide, which carried no penalty. It was agreed no autopsy was necessary. The following morning, a hostile crowd began to gather near the stables. Fearing further unrest, the police consulted the Reverend Lowry Hamilton, the rector of St. Wilfrid's, with a view of burying Cotterell immediately. This was a delicate matter. At the time, suicide was not only a crime, but a sin. Fearing a riot, the rector grudgingly agreed to Cotterell's immediate interment. The policeman hastily dug a grave and buried the murderer at the churchyard's perimeter behind the Victorian wall postbox. Amid jeering from the villagers who gathered at the churchyard wall, the Reverend stood by the grave and delivered a short funeral service. A week later, in contrast, through flurries of falling snow, Dyson's funeral cortege moved slowly through the village on its way to Cheetham Hill Cemetery, Manchester. The villagers lined the streets and lanes to watch the solemn horse-drawn procession pass and to pay their last respects. Despite the stir the gruesome events had caused, it was the rector's wish that the village could quickly move on and forget. In the parish magazine of March, he told parishioners that it was his hope that the manner of the solicitor's cruel death might be forgotten and his generosity and kindness remembered. But Cotterell, or rather his spirit, it seemed, refused to rest. Before long, a folk story emerged, and he became the village bogeyman. You see, from that time onward, around the village, a rumour spread that Cotterell's stooped figure, now a shade, was often spied beside the church wall. In March, a maid sent to post a letter after dusk claimed that her fingers had slipped too far into the box and that something icy and sharp had pinched them. She refused to post letters there again. From then on, the villagers warned all those posting letters on Halloween or the anniversary of the murder to beware. Lest Cottrell grab your hand and pull you to hell. Generations of Northenden parents used Cottrell as a means to chastise their errant and naughty children. At dusk, such children would be erranded to the old post box to post a letter there. Unlike most village tales, this is a true story, brought to you by Cast the Past. I'm Stephen Evans. Thanks for listening.